Pride is a funny thing. It blinds an arrogant man to the very foundation holding him up. When Henry stood before a crowded ballroom and reduced his wife to a cheap punchline, he didn't realize he wasn't just breaking her heart, he was signing his own corporate death warrant. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York City was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, glittering diamonds, and the intoxicating scent of old money mixing with new tech wealth. It was the annual gala for Stefan Innovations, a data security firm that had recently secured a valuation of $600 million. At the center of this opulent universe was the CEO and founder, Henry Stefan. Tall, sharp-jawed, and radiating the kind of aggressive charisma that Silicon Valley worships, Henry was the man of the hour. And standing quietly in his shadow, holding a flute of untouched champagne, was his wife, Linda Pendleton. Linda was not the typical tech billionaire's wife. In a room full of size 0 X models and impeccably sculpted socialites, Linda was a comfortably plus-size woman. She wore a custom-made midnight blue gown that she had paid a small fortune for, hoping it would make her feel elegant. Instead, under the glaring crystal chandeliers and the judgmental eyes of Henry's inner circle, she felt like a poorly disguised intruder. She constantly tugged at the empire waist of her dress, hyper-aware of the soft curves of her stomach and the fullness of her arms. "Linda, darling," a sickeningly sweet voice purred. Linda braced herself. It was Chloe Carmichael, Henry's 26-year-old vice president of public relations. Chloe was built like a greyhound, lean, nervous energy, wrapped in a shimmering gold slip dress that left nothing to the imagination. "Chloe, the event looks wonderful," Linda said, keeping her tone perfectly polite. "Doesn't it?" "Henry has been working so hard," Chloe said, placing a possessive emphasis on Henry's name. Her eyes flicked up and down Linda's figure, a smirk playing at the corners of her glossed lips. "I must say, you're so brave for wearing horizontal ruching. I tell my tailor to strictly forbid it, but it's so forgiving on a larger frame, isn't it?" Linda felt a familiar flush of heat crawl up her neck. For 5 years, ever since Stefan Innovations began to take off, she had endured these subtle, venomous microaggressions. She endured them because she loved Henry. She remembered the Henry from a decade ago, the terrified, brilliant man who wept on their cheap IKEA sofa when his first 3 startups failed. She remembered the man who told her she was his sanctuary, but the man mingling across the room, laughing raucously with a group of venture capitalists, was a stranger. Wealth had not just changed Henry, it had unmasked him. "Excuse me," Linda murmured, turning away from Chloe's predatory gaze. She moved toward the edge of the room, seeking the anonymity of the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes. A sharp clinking of a spoon against crystal brought the room's ambient hum to a dead silence. The spotlight snapped to the main stage. Henry jogged up the steps, flashing a $1 million smile. The crowd erupted into applause. "Thank you. Thank you all," Henry began, adjusting the microphone. His voice echoed with practiced confidence. "Looking out at this room, I see the pioneers of tomorrow. When I started Stefan Innovations, I was told that our goals were too big, that the market was too saturated. But we didn't just disrupt the industry, we crushed it." More applause. Linda watched him, a bittersweet knot tightening in her chest. She was proud of him, even if he had grown distant. She hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he might acknowledge the sacrifices they had made together. "Of course, building an empire requires heavy lifting," Henry continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. He locked eyes with Chloe in the front row, who offered him a knowing, wicked smile. Then his gaze drifted to the back of the room, finding Linda. "They say that behind every great man is a great woman," Henry said. The crowd offered a polite murmur of agreement. "And I have to say, my wife Linda has been behind me for a long time." Linda offered a small, tentative smile. In fact, Henry's voice took on a teasing, theatrical cadence. "She's been behind me so much, she's practically blocking out the sun." A few uncertain chuckles rippled through the front rows. Linda's smile froze. Henry leaned into the microphone, his ego completely overriding any sense of basic human decency. "Seriously, folks, when we started this company, I told her I needed a massive anchor to keep me grounded. Looking at her now, I think I got more than my money's worth. I mean, I had to upgrade the suspension on the corporate jet just to get her to Aspen last month." The silence in the room lasted for a fraction of a second before the dam broke. Chloe let out a sharp, piercing laugh, which acted as a permission slip for the rest of the room. Suddenly, 500 of the wealthiest, most influential people in New York were roaring with laughter. Men in tuxedos slapped each other on the back. Women covered their mouths, their eyes darting to the back of the room to find the punchline. Linda stood, paralyzed. The laughter hit her like physical blows. The heat in her face was so intense she thought she might spontaneously combust. She looked at Henry, desperately hoping to see immediate regret on his face. Instead, he was beaming, basking in the glow of his successful joke, completely oblivious to the public execution he had just performed on his marriage. He didn't see a devoted wife. He saw a prop, a fat, convenient prop to make him look like the charming, relatable rogue. In that singular, agonizing moment, the spell broke. The deep, unconditional love Linda had harbored for Henry Stephan evaporated, replaced by an icy, crystalline clarity. The trembling in her hands stopped. The flush of embarrassment faded, leaving her skin pale and cold. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply set her champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray, turned on her heel, and walked out of the ballroom. The hallway outside the grand ballroom was quiet, heavily carpeted, and lined with gilded mirrors. As Linda walked toward the VIP lounge, her reflection followed her. She didn't see a broken, humiliated woman. She saw the most powerful person in the building. Henry had always been an excellent salesman, a brilliant coder, and a charismatic leader. But Henry was also financially illiterate and remarkably naive when it came to corporate structuring. What the 500 laughing hyenas in the ballroom didn't know, what Henry didn't know, was the true origin of Stephan Innovations' seed money. 5 years ago, when Henry's third company went bankrupt, he was blacklisted by every venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. He was drowning in $1 million of personal debt. It was during that dark period that a mysterious private equity firm out of London, Pendleton Capital Holdings, swooped in. They offered Henry a lifeline, $8 million in seed funding to build his data security concept. Henry was ecstatic. He thought his genius had finally been recognized by international heavyweights. He gladly signed the extraordinarily complex 70-page funding agreement presented by the firm's ruthless New York proxy lawyer, Harrison Cole. What Henry never bothered to investigate was that Pendleton Capital Holdings belonged entirely to his quiet, unassuming wife. Linda was the sole heir to her late grandfather, Arthur Pendleton, a British real estate magnate. She had hidden her vast wealth from Henry early in their relationship, wanting to be loved for herself, not her trust fund. When he hit rock bottom, she couldn't bear to see him destroyed. So, she saved him. But she was no fool. Guided by her grandfather's cutthroat financial advisors, Linda structured the funding as a heavily guarded trapdoor, Pendleton Capital owned 85% of the Class A voting shares of Stefan Innovations. Henry owned a paltry 15%, though he was granted the title of CEO and total operational control, as long as he didn't breach the morality and fiduciary clauses buried in Section 4 of the contract. Linda stepped into the deserted VIP lounge and locked the heavy oak door behind her. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Central Park, the city lights reflecting in her dark, furious eyes. She pulled her phone from her clutch. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. It rang twice. "Linda," a deep, gravelly voice answered. It was Harrison Cole. "Harrison, I apologize for calling so late on a Saturday," Linda said, her voice perfectly steady. "You're the boss, Linda, literally. What do you need? I thought you were at the Stefan Gala." "I was. I just left," Linda said, running a hand over the expensive fabric of her dress. "Harrison, I want to execute the Section 4 breach protocols. All of them. Tonight." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Harrison was a shark, a man who dismantled corporations for sport, but even he sounded momentarily taken aback. "Section 4. Linda, that's the nuclear option. If I trigger that, it instantly calls in the original mezzanine debt with penalty interest, revokes his executive authority, and locks down the company's operating accounts. You're talking about seizing the company." "I am aware of what I am talking about, Harrison. Did he do something? Is it a financial breach?" "It's a moral breach," Linda said coldly. "He publicly humiliated the primary shareholder. I want him out. I want his access to the servers revoked. I want the corporate credit cards frozen. And I want the termination notice delivered to his personal device before he finishes his dessert." Harrison let out a low whistle. He crossed the wrong woman. "All right, Linda. The infrastructure for this has been in place since day one. I have the emergency injunctions pre-filed with a judge who owes me a favor. It will take my team exactly 12 minutes to lock him out of the AWS servers and freeze the Chase commercial accounts. Are you absolutely certain? Burn it down, Harrison, and transfer ownership of his company car to my name while you're at it. I'm tired of taking Ubers." "Consider him a ghost," Harrison said. The line clicked dead. Back in the ballroom, Henry was riding the high of his life. He had finished his speech to roaring applause and was currently holding court at table 1, surrounded by investors and a very attentive Chloe. "That joke was a bit risky, Rich," one of the board members, a grey-haired man named David, said with a nervous chuckle. "You sure Linda won't skin you alive when you get home?" Henry waved his hand dismissively, taking a sip of $1,000 scotch. "Oh, relax, David. Linda's got thick skin. Pun intended. She knows she's lucky to be here. She's not going anywhere." Chloe giggled, leaning her hand on Henry's arm. "You're so bad, Henry." "I'm just honest," Henry grinned, leaning back in his chair. "You have to dominate your environment. That's how I built this company from nothing. Pure, unadulterated willpower and absolute control over my assets." At exactly 10:14 p.m., Henry's phone buzzed in his tuxedo pocket. He ignored it. He was busy explaining his genius vision for Q3. It buzzed again, and again. Then Chloe's phone buzzed, then David's. Within seconds, a bizarre, synchronized vibration seemed to ripple across the VIP tables near the front of the room. Frowning, Henry pulled out his iPhone. The screen was lit up with notifications. Urgent. Chase commercial. All accounts frozen. Contact administrator. System alert. A WS route. Access revoked. Invalid credentials. Email. h.cole@pendletoncapital.com. Subject. Termination of employment. Henry blinked, the alcohol buzzing in his brain, making it difficult to process the words on the screen. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. "Henry," David said, his face suddenly turning the color of wet ash as he stared at his own tablet. "Henry, did you authorize a complete server lockdown? The engineering team in India is messaging me on Slack. They say the entire back end has been seized by an external administrative override." "No, of course not," Henry snapped, his heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He tapped furiously on his phone, trying to log into the executive dashboard. Access denied. User not found. "Chloe," Henry barked. "Call IT, now. Tell them we're being hacked." Chloe was staring at her phone, her eyes wide with panic. "Henry, my corporate card just declined. I was trying to settle the bar tab for the after party. It says the account does not exist." "That's impossible. We have 80 million in liquid operating cash in that account." Henry stood up, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. The confident, arrogant swagger he possessed just 10 minutes prior was rapidly dissolving into pure, unadulterated terror. He opened the email from an address he vaguely recognized from the early days of his funding. Harrison Cole. "Mr. Stephan, effective immediately. Per Section 4, Clause 12b, moral turpitude and reputational damage of your primary funding agreement with Pendleton Capital Holdings, your tenure as CEO of Stephan Innovations is terminated. Your equity has been seized to cover the immediate calling of your outstanding debt. You are legally barred from the premises of the company headquarters. The majority shareholder sends her regards." Henry felt the blood drain from his head. He gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "Majority shareholder," he whispered frantically. "Pendleton Capital, a J. Pendleton, Arthur." His mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations from years ago. Arthur Pendleton. Linda's grandfather was named Arthur Pendleton. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He spun around, pushing past a bewildered Chloe, and stared toward the back of the room where he had last seen his wife. The velvet drapes hung undisturbed. The shadows were empty. Linda was gone. "Where is my wife?" Henry roared, the sheer panic in his voice silencing the surrounding tables. "Where is Linda?" Downstairs, the crisp New York night air hit Linda's face as she stepped out of the plaza's revolving doors. The valet rushed forward, opening the door to a sleek, black Maybach. "Evening, Mrs. Stephan," the valet said politely. Linda paused before sliding into the plush leather seat. She looked back up at the towering, illuminated windows of the hotel ballroom. A slow, genuinely beautiful smile spread across her face. "Actually, it's Miss Pendleton," she said. "Take me home, please. I have a company to run in the morning." Sunday morning arrived not with the gentle glow of a victory hangover, but with the brutal, blinding light of financial ruin. Henry Stephan woke up on the stiff, floral-patterned sofa of his lawyer's guest room in Upper Manhattan. He hadn't slept. His tuxedo was heavily wrinkled, smelling of stale scotch, nervous sweat, and the distinct metallic tang of fear. The night before, after fleeing the Plaza Hotel in a blind panic, he had directed his driver to take him to his Tribeca penthouse, only to discover his key fob flashing a harsh, unforgiving red. The building's concierge, a usually deferential man named Luis, had stood in the lobby with a sympathetic but firm expression, flanked by 2 private security contractors. Luis had handed Henry a manila envelope. Inside was a legally binding notice of eviction, citing that the penthouse was, in fact, owned by a subsidiary trust of Pendleton Capital Holdings. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stephan," Luis had said quietly, refusing to meet Henry's bloodshot eyes. "Miss Pendleton's legal team was very thorough. We've been instructed to box your personal effects and ship them to a storage unit in Queens." Now, sitting in the harsh daylight of his lawyer's apartment, Henry stared at his phone. The battery was at 4%. It was a graveyard of abandoned loyalties. He had called Chloe Carmichael 14 times. On the 15th try, he received a single, automated iMessage reply. Chloe has notifications silenced. An hour later, she posted an Instagram story from the Hampton Jitney, holding a matcha latte, with the caption, "New beginnings, detox weekend." She was gone. The board members were gone. David had sent one terse email stating he was seeking independent legal counsel. The ecosystem of sycophants that Henry had cultivated over 5 years had evaporated the moment his black card declined. "Drink this," Greg muttered, handing Henry a mug of black coffee. Greg was a corporate litigator and Henry's oldest friend. He looked exhausted, having spent the last 6 hours reviewing the 70-page original funding agreement that Henry had blithely signed 5 years ago. "Tell me there's a loophole," Henry rasped, ignoring the coffee. "Tell me we can file an injunction. It's my company, Greg. My name is on the damn building. I wrote the original base code." Greg sighed heavily, dropping the thick stack of papers onto the glass coffee table with a resounding thud. "Rich, you didn't read this when you signed it, did you? You just saw the $8 million and signed where Harrison Cole told you to." "I was focused on the product. I trusted my legal team back then." "Your legal team back then was a junior associate who was clearly outgunned by Pendleton's sharks," Greg said, rubbing his temples. "Henry, this isn't just an employment contract. It's a predatory lending agreement disguised as seed equity. The moral turpitude clause, Section 4, paragraph 12b, is insanely broad. It gives the majority shareholder the right to trigger an immediate default on the mezzanine debt if the CEO engages in conduct that brings public shame, ridicule, or reputational harm to the corporate entity or its primary stakeholders." "It was a joke," Henry exploded, standing up and pacing the small room. "It was a damn joke at a gala. Comedians say worse every night. You weren't doing a tight 5 at the Comedy Cellar, Henry. You humiliated the sole heir to the Pendleton estate, who happens to own 85% of your voting shares, in front of 500 industry leaders and the press," Greg shot back, his patience thinning. "And because she triggered the default, the entire $8 million principal, plus 5 years of compounded penalty interest, is due immediately." Henry stopped pacing. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. "How much?" $12.4 million, Greg said quietly. "And because your equity was used as collateral for the operational control, it's gone. Seized. You own 0% of Stefan Innovations. You have no job, no severance, and a $12 million anchor tied around your neck. She didn't just fire you, Rich. She financially vaporized you." Henry sank back onto the sofa, the air rushing out of his lungs. The towering, impenetrable fortress of his ego was crumbling brick by brick. For the first time in his life, he was forced to look at the reality of his success. He hadn't built an empire on his own. He had built a house of cards on a foundation financed by the very woman he had treated like an embarrassing footnote. "What do I do?" Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "You pack a bag," Greg advised gently, "and you pray she doesn't decide to sue you for the remaining debt, because if she wants to, she can take your watch, your shoes, and your future wages until the day you die." Monday morning, at the Stefan Innovations headquarters in the financial district, was crackling with a terrifying, electric uncertainty. The sleek glass-walled offices on the 44th floor of One World Trade Center were usually buzzing with the arrogant energy of a tech unicorn. Today, it was as quiet as a crypt. Rumors had spread like wildfire over the weekend. The CEO was locked out. The AWS servers had been hijacked and restored. The corporate accounts were frozen and subsequently transferred. At exactly 8:45 a.m., the private executive elevator dinged. The entire open-plan engineering floor collectively held its breath. Stepping out of the elevator was not the aggressive, loud, Patagonia vest-wearing Henry Stephan. It was Linda. She wore a masterfully tailored, emerald green wool crepe suit that complemented her curves perfectly, exuding a quiet, lethal elegance. Her posture, usually slightly slouched to avoid drawing attention, was now ramrod straight. Beside her walked Harrison Cole, carrying a sleek leather briefcase, looking like a grim reaper in a Tom Ford suit. Linda walked calmly through the rows of standing desks. She didn't march, she glided. The engineers, project managers, and marketing directors stared at her in stunned silence. This was the woman they had seen briefly at holiday parties, the one their former CEO had openly mocked just 48 hours prior. Today, she looked like a sovereign stepping onto conquered soil. She reached the glass-walled executive boardroom at the center of the floor. David, the senior board member, was already waiting inside, looking physically ill. "Good morning, everyone," Linda said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a crystalline clarity that carried across the dead, silent floor. "Please, gather around the glass. I have a brief announcement." Slowly the staff left their desks and formed a large, hesitant circle around the boardroom. "As you are all aware, there has been a change in leadership," Linda began, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "My name is Linda Pendleton. I am the president of Pendleton Capital Holdings, the primary financial backer of this company since its inception. Effective Saturday night, Henry Stephan was terminated as CEO. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. "This company's data security tech is brilliant," Linda continued, sweeping her gaze across the young, nervous faces. "But the corporate culture was toxic, built on arrogance, exclusion, and a profound lack of respect. That ends today. I will be stepping in as the interim CEO, while we conduct a global search for Henry's replacement. Your jobs are secure. The payroll accounts are fully funded. The only thing that is changing is the ego in the corner office." Before she could continue, a loud commotion erupted near the reception area. "Get your hands off me! I built this company! You can't keep me out of my own building!" The crowd parted as Henry, looking disheveled, frantic, and wearing the same wrinkled tuxedo trousers from Saturday night, shoved past two bewildered security guards. He stormed toward the boardroom, his face a mask of desperate fury. He stopped a few feet from the glass, locking eyes with Linda. The silence in the room was absolute, so thick it felt suffocating. "Linda," Henry breathed, his chest heaving. The anger in his eyes quickly gave way to a pathetic, pleading desperation as he looked at her standing behind the massive oak conference table. "Linda, please, you can't do this. I'm sorry. I was drunk. It was a stupid joke. You know I love you." Linda looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no vindictiveness. Worse, there was only a profound, freezing indifference. It was the look one gives a stranger who is causing a scene in a grocery store. "Mr. Stephan," Linda said calmly, purposely using his surname to shatter any illusion of intimacy. "You are trespassing on private property." "It's my company," Henry yelled, slamming his hand against the thick glass wall. A few engineers jumped back. "I wrote the code. I pitched the clients. You just wrote a check." "I built the safety net you walked all over," Linda replied, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy weight of absolute authority. "You were an employee, Henry. An employee who fundamentally misunderstood his value. You thought your charm and your aggressive posturing made you invincible. You were so busy looking down on me, so busy making sure everyone else looked down on me. that you never bothered to look up and see who held the strings. Henry opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the engineers and developers he had terrorized and belittled for years. Not a single face offered him sympathy. They looked at him with pity. "You broke the morality clause, Henry," Linda said, stepping closer to the glass. "But more importantly, you broke my heart. And while I can eventually forgive the latter, my legal team will never forgive the former." Harrison. Harrison Cole stepped forward, pulling a document from his briefcase. "Mr. Stephan, if you do not vacate these premises within 30 seconds, the New York Police Department will be called to escort you out, and I will personally file the paperwork to begin seizing your offshore crypto assets to satisfy your $12 million debt to Pendleton Capital." Henry stared at Linda, the devastating reality of his new existence finally crushing him. He had nothing. He was nothing. The brilliant, untouchable tech titan had been utterly dismantled by the woman he thought was merely a punchline. He slumped his shoulders, the fight completely draining out of him. He turned away from the glass, away from his former employees, and walked slowly toward the exit, a hollow shell of a man. Linda watched him go, feeling a strange, hollow closure. She turned back to the room of hundreds of wide-eyed employees. She offered them a small, genuine smile. "Now," Linda said, picking up a dry erase marker and uncapping it. "Let's review the Q3 security projections. I believe we have a lot of work to do." True power doesn't need to shout from a stage or belittle others to feel tall. Linda Pendleton proved that the heaviest weight she carried wasn't her body, but the dead weight of an arrogant man. By dropping him, she didn't just reclaim her dignity. She conquered an empire. Pride comes before the fall, but for Linda, it was just the beginning of her ascent.